Hi everyone, welcome to our roundtable event on the theme with the theme Sustainable Futures in Europe. So today we wanted to have this roundtable to hear from experts and researchers about the theme of sustainability during the pandemic, especially. So today we have three speakers. So first we have Dr. Rosa Fernandez, who is the Deputy Head of Department at the University of Chester. Also, she's the Program Leader in Economics. She works on energy-related issues ranging from energy economics and policies to sustainable development. Then we have Dr. Jonas Schönefeld, who is a researcher at the Institute for Housing and Environment. He works on issues including, but not limited to, energy, climate, and environmental politics, and policy monitoring and evaluation. And finally, we have Jon Worth, who is a well-known blogger on EU politics. He is also a visiting lecturer at the College of Europe in Bruges, where he teaches EU politics. So I want to start the discussion. Before the discussion, I want to give the floor to speakers to make their introductory speeches. And when we were trying to communicating with each other and trying to find a theme for the initial remarks, we thought that challenges to sustainability in Europe during and after the pandemic, after the COVID-19 crisis, could be a useful theme to first focus on, and of course sustainability in our experts' areas of expertise. So I want to give the floor to Dr. Rosa Fernandez first, and Dr. Fernandez. Each speaker will have 10 minutes for their initial remarks, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Baris. I'll definitely try to stick to time. I have prepared a very, very short presentation, so let me see if I can share it with you. So, okay, what I've been trying to do is to be very brief. Talking about sustainability in times of COVID is not easy. So I thought I will approach it from the point of view of dealing with the three pillars of sustainability: economic, social, and environmental, and how they have been affected by the pandemic, and what are the plans to get out of the current situation. And hopefully some of the areas that I'm going to touch upon will be also mentioned by the other two speakers and further in the discussion. So in terms of where we are at the moment, it's clear that COVID is a world health crisis. But the main effects, apart from the loss of life that we are experiencing everywhere, the most significant impact at the moment is being in the economies, in terms of particular increases in unemployment levels due to having to close down in different lockdowns, economic activities in many sectors of the economy. And that is something that is probably going to change the way in which different industries and sectors work in the future. So we are already seeing some trends. Obviously, the fact that transport industries and traveling has been disrupted. One of the things that has been going on is the decrease in the use of global supply chains and countries trying to reinforce domestic production. We have seen that with PPE equipment and the like. And all the countries right now are designing and implementing different types of interventions to try and bring economic growth back. So we could say that in terms of the three pillars of sustainability, the economic one is the one that has been at the forefront of the interest of all these strategies that have been designed or at least commented. And obviously this is related to the fact that all these has been mainly through government intervention, so it's public money what is being launched at all this. And sooner or later, thinking on economic terms, that debt that countries are accumulating will need to be paid back. So probably we will see more social consequences of this in the future, depending on how countries approach this. But something that has been, I would say, welcome is the fact that in most countries, what has been emerging is the so-called green recovery plans. All these ideas of building back better are mostly linked to the fact that when all the economies started closing down, greenhouse gas emissions started decreasing. And because of that, people started thinking that really we could do something to change the way in which we develop the type of activities that we do. So at the moment, what we have is in most countries individually, and then in the European Union as a whole, green recovery plans are being created with a lot of funding being dedicated to it. But many of the measures that have been developed, proposed, or even implemented have been disjointed. They have been targeting very specific sectors of the economy. The main one that is being targeted at the moment seems to be the building sector with regard to increased levels of energy efficiency and the creation of the so-called green jobs. A bit later on, we are hearing much more about renewable electricity and hydrogen, electric vehicles, and then different aspects, mostly related to energy with heating as well, and then agriculture. And to a less extent, we are also hearing about the possibility to adapt to climate change, thinking more of an integration of the environmental aspect. But so far, as I said, what I can see is that most of the measures that have been implemented up to now, some of them have contributed to environmental targets in a positive way. Some others have contributed to environmental targets in a negative way. And it can be said that there is a balance of each other out. So we cannot see really positive outcomes on environmental terms from the policies that have been implemented at the moment. So in my opinion, what we have is a huge opportunity at the moment to take on a much more integrated approach in the solutions that are proposed. Everybody's calling for implementations of measures as we see in the slides: investment in health, education, infrastructure, research and innovation. Also keeping critical social spending, which goes obviously towards that social pillar of sustainability, and the economic one with standards of transparency and fiscal measures. More and more we have calls for that reduction or elimination of subsidies to non-green sectors, but also the understanding that if you are going to support financially and fiscally the green sectors, that support needs to be gradually disappearing. It's a support that is not supposed to be there forever. And not everybody's taking very well that approach. In the EU, as I mentioned, the latest approach has to do with the European Green Deal, which includes the investment necessary, the financing tools available, and the mention of ensuring a just and inclusive transition. So it's about a transition to low carbon, which deals with environment inclusivity, which deals with the social, and obviously creating green jobs. Thinking of the economic pillars, which looks very good, and you have specific measures, but so far what we have had is a very slow progress on the implementation of these proposals. It's true that the European Green Deal started appearing only last year with von der Leyen Commission, but we have issues coming from the different member states and the role that they are going to play or not. At the moment, we already have issues for the approval of the next EU budget and the link to the rule of law. Again, thinking of democracy and issues of governance. And what I see at the moment is that at the high level, there seems to be this message of inclusivity and citizen ownership and citizens participation. But when you go to the lower level, the role of the citizens gets diluted. So the possibility of this being successful, unless you really count on the participation of all the stakeholders and not the typical one as per usual, is debatable. So I'm hoping to hear more ideas from the other speakers and discuss about this. I hope I stayed in time, more or less.
Yeah, spot on actually, and you have 22 seconds early. So thank you very much, Dr. Fernandez. Very interesting thoughts, and I always thought that the Green Deal, European Green Deal, was an interesting idea, and I was also surprised with the speed of this initiative. I think it was a few days into von der Leyen's presidency, and then she called it was a man on the moon moment for Europe, something quite remarkable. But of course, I think there are a lot of question marks still remain on that point. So let's now give the floor to Dr. Jonas Schönefeld for his contributions.
Thank you very much, and thank you once again for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to be in touch with the Graduate Student Forum, of which I was a member for a good long time and still a UASIS member to this day. Can you all see my slides? Yeah.
Yeah.
Just to make sure that you all see that. Okay, so what I've prepared today is a set of slides on some work that we've done, or we started doing a few years ago, and then finished to a certain degree about a year ago, so just before the pandemic started. And but before I get into this, actually, I think my presentation fits very well with what Rosa was just saying about the Green Deal. We were discussing at the Institute for Housing and Environment, where I now work, we were discussing the impacts of the COVID crisis on these plans in the context of the renovation wave, something that Rosa already mentioned. And if you look at that document, interestingly, there are a few paragraphs in there which basically say COVID exacerbates existing problems. So people having to live in buildings that are overheating in the summer or too cold in the winter, that are struggling with energy poverty, that may be living in places that are too small, too crowded, where there are no green spaces around, and so on and so forth. All of that, of course, becomes a lot more burdensome when you are in quarantine or you need to spend a lot more time at home. So there's a very strong focus these days on buildings, because we spend a lot more time in buildings, and also discussion about the long-term impacts of those developments. So taking that into account, I think it is useful to look at particularly that Green Deal and the ways in which the European Commission is trying to move forward on that with its sustainability efforts. Now, Rosa already talked about the Green Deal. I just put up this little slide here, no need to read it. It's just to say that the Green Deal is sort of an overall strategic approach that's trying to bring together a whole range of policy areas that have so far been separate or a little bit integrated, including energy, climate, environment, agriculture, and others. And one of the headline targets there is this net zero emissions by 2050 target that Rosa also mentioned. Climate neutrality, in a nutshell, it basically means that by 2050, the European Union won't put more greenhouse gases that cause climate change into the atmosphere than it takes up. Now, this is a game changer. And why do I think it's a game changer? Because it means that you cannot omit certain sectors anymore, at least not at a large scale. Before, up to 2020, potentially also up to 2030, we basically still had the luxury of saying we're going to leave certain sectors out because they may be too hard to address in terms of sustainability. So in climate policy, we focused a lot on energy policy, on getting our electricity supply decarbonized, for example, and have by and large neglected the mobility sector, where there are now new efforts, of course, but so far progress has been very slow there. And there's basically been this picking and choosing. But with a 2050 carbon neutrality target, that luxury no longer exists if we are serious about it. But then comes the next challenge. Many of the sectors where change will need to happen, and change will need to happen fast, are areas where the EU has either no or very little competence. For example, the area of energy policy, also aspects of climate policy, and others. When you look at energy policy, the European institutions have no authority to tell the member states what sort of energy mix they should have, and so on. And all the while, they have these highly ambitious climate targets, which imply large levels of change. So what are the solutions from the past to deal with this? In situations where there's a need for coordination, but little willingness to extend European level competence, there's often been a focus on soft governance. Things like the open method of coordination, policy monitoring, evaluation and review, and other things, political declarations, anything basically that generates some sort of political direction without putting it into law and enforcing it through the courts. Now, time and again, scholars have pointed to the fact that in many areas, the soft governance has struggled with lacking effectiveness. So putting in place political declarations, of course, doesn't actually change anything immediately. Something else needs to happen afterwards, and there have been huge question marks over, what can actually get done with these sorts of things. Now, we argue that in response to that, we're now seeing a new type of governance emerging in the area of energy, climate, and also other economics and so on, which we've called the new harder soft governance. This harder soft governance rests on a soft governance foundation, which typically exists beforehand, which is then enhanced with harder elements. And we've created a special issue. We've tried to catalog these a little bit, but they can be things like increasing the obligation of certain elements in political declarations, in these soft law pieces, increasing the justification. For example, if you monitor the member states on their climate policies and oblige them to justify more why they're doing something or not doing it, that can have a hardening effect. You can increase the precision, going from saying we need to do something about climate change to saying we need a specific target, that make it more precise. Increasing opportunities for blaming and shaming, basically putting things out into the open, using transparency to create pressure and therefore then incentives to change. Increasing the role of third-party actors or international actors. Bundling, bringing things together. For example, the energy union is an approach to try to bring different policy fields together in one coherent framework, and enforcing by coupling with other policy fields. This means if you want to get something done, let's say on climate change or on energy, you could couple it with another policy fields like cohesion policy and create links by saying if you don't do something here, then you won't do something there. An example of this is what Rosa just mentioned, the discussions now about the multi-annual financial framework and the rule of law. that's an example of coupling. You bring two things together in order to achieve something. Now, where does this come from? When do we see the rise of this form of governance? Well, as I said before, soft governance tends to be the starting point. It's often more flexible, easier to get, to implement, and so forth. But then you get this growing dissatisfaction with soft governance on account of its lacking efficacy. And when it then, in addition to that, you get certain enabling conditions, like a strong need for coordination, as is the case with climate change, environmental issues, and so on, the will of the member states, or a good part of them, to act, and institutional and organizational opportunity structures to implement those hardening elements. And on top of that, actors which can act as policy entrepreneurs and be a little bit creative, then you can get this sort of harder soft governance to emerge. Now, an example of this, which I've put up on the slide, please don't try to read all of this or understand it immediately. There's no need. This is basically the system that the European Union currently has to monitor its greenhouse gases and also its climate policies. So across the European Union, there's around about 2,000 climate policies put in place in the member states. And this is a system where the member states collect data. It's then checked by the European Environment Agency and then later reported out to different levels, the European Union, the UN, and so on and so forth. And in one of the contributions to the special issue, we looked at different elements of hardening or harder elements in this climate policy monitoring. And this is an overview table. Again, please don't try to read this. I'll just go through some elements that we've seen. We've begun by comparing the monitoring mechanism decision of 2004 with the monitoring mechanism regulation of 2013. And we discovered that the legal text has become longer between those two revisions. There's been a little bit more quality assurance. New things have emerged in the new reporting. For example, countries now have to report on low carbon strategies. The reporting on policies has been enhanced a little bit, but also a little bit weakened. There is some reporting on projections, although that has remained more or less similar. A big point has been the adaptation and financial and technology reporting to developing countries. So, what sort of aids are being provided and so on. There's more of that. There's more expert review in the new monitoring mechanism regulation. Data has become more available. There's more links with reporting streams, and there's more incorporation in other policy planning exercises, such as the national energy and climate plans. I know that was a long list, but if you take all of that together, you can basically see how the European institutions, the European Commission and the Environment Agency are trying to enhance this monitoring, because they don't have competencies to address all the different elements of these policy areas, but they think that if they do good monitoring, if they create transparent knowledge about what's going on, then they can somehow nudge the member states in the direction that they want to go. An example here is the European Environment Agency's Policies and Measures Data Viewer, where you can see up here, for example, these are the number of policies from different countries, climate policies. Down here are whether the policies have been implemented, are planned, expired, and so on. And there's a whole list of different things where you can work through these data and understand what's going on in the member states. Now, what are the particular drivers in this case? Well, we've seen the European Commission taking an entrepreneurial role and really pushing this, because it seeks to extend its own competence and enable steering capacity to actually reach the long-term targets. Role of the European Parliament has been a little bit unclear. There's some interesting debates on monitoring from the past, but I think the Parliament is fairly new in this area, so still finding its feet. The member states have been a little bit divided. Some have pushed for more policy monitoring, review, evaluations, others less. And the European Environment Agency has played a supporting and encouraging role in terms of expanding and improving the monitoring systems. So now going back to where I started, will harder soft governance then, if we can see it emerging, will it deliver climate neutrality by 2050? Now we can see harder soft governance emerging in various policy areas. I got a whole list here for you. We've seen it in climate policy monitoring. Then if you look at the special issue in the Energy Union, the UN, the OECD, the open method of coordination, the European semester, and transnational city networks. So it has become a phenomenon that you can observe in many different areas. But we can't actually say yet whether it will be effective. And that's perhaps a frustrating thing, but it's also an exciting and interesting thing for us as researchers to say, well, this new governance approach that we're seeing through the Green Deal, that we're seeing through the Energy Union, the Paris Agreement and others, will it actually deliver climate neutrality by 2050? Will it deliver the targets it wants to deliver? And that remains a big open question that we think would be a good research question to address and work on going forward. So if you're interested in this work, just quickly a few conclusions. As I said, action is necessary in virtually all policy fields with this climate neutrality target. We got limited or no EU competences in key policy areas where change needs to happen. And we're seeing the emergence of new harder soft governance. And then have a key topic for future research, which is the effects of this kind of governing. So if you're interested in this kind of research, then we have put together a special issue that's most of it is open access. You can have a look here. I don't know, maybe the slides will be distributed later on. I'd be happy to do that. Yeah, feel free to have a look at that. And that is it from me. I hope I haven't taken too much time, Baris, and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. That's not a problem. I would also like to announce to the audience that you can type your questions to the chat room if you have any questions at this point, and then we can come back to them in the Q&A. Very interesting thoughts, Jonas. I'm always fascinated to see how certain provisions increase in the EU during times of crisis. And I think effectiveness is a different issue, but even if they may or may not be effective, I think the existence of them is still significant and worth considering. So let's give the floor to Jon Worth now to hear from his views on the theme.
Right, thank you very much. And my apologies, I don't have any slides to show here, so you'll have to just deal with me talking and giving a brief introduction. Please also don't overdo the fact that I teach at the College of Europe. I was basically brought in there on the kind of practitioner side, teaching at the College of Europe rather than on the academic side. I teach about EU politics and communications, and I also do all of the technology for the negotiation simulation at the College of Europe. Building on that, I've essentially got 3 points. The first is what we learn about how the European Union has coped with the COVID crisis and what might that, and perhaps a word on Brexit and the Brexit crisis, and start from that. And then I want to look at sustainability in 2 aspects and how they relate to each other, which is the institutional sustainability of the European Union as a political actor, and how the lessons of dealing with the Green New Deal and environmental sustainability maybe tell us some lessons about that and how those 2 aspects fit together. The EU, I think, has had, as an institution, overall in institutional terms, has had a comparatively good coronavirus crisis. At the very beginning, there was the problem of coordination and a problem of closing borders, which I feel was a kind of an inevitable consequence of a major health issue that the member states of the European Union had to deal with. But in my capacity, another hat I have is as the deputy chair of the EU Policy Committee of the German Green Party. We've been investigating this to a certain extent about what happened at Germany's borders immediately post those borders formally closing. And indeed, the European Union actually helped solve some of those everyday problems at Europe's borders relatively quickly for cross-border commuters, for example. So although you couldn't, if you were in Berlin, cross to Poland to go and buy some cheap cigarettes or alcohol, which is what is known to most of the Berlin population, those people that lived on one side of the border and had to work on the other side of the border, solutions were found to those sorts of problems relatively quickly. And second, if you look also comparatively at how joint procurement was done by the European Union, not only of personal protective equipment, but also dealing with procurement of vaccines and the cost that the European Union has managed to negotiate with vaccine suppliers in comparison to the cost that the UK has managed to negotiate. The European Union stacks up comparatively well. Now, there are some difficulties. So those of you that speak German, for example, you may have seen it in the German and the Austrian press. So there's a big argument currently ongoing in German politics about the EU is closing our ski resorts at Christmas, which it isn't. But bear in mind that the EU can't close or open ski resorts or not, because it can only have a coordination role. So these kind of arguments will play out. But if you simply look at the competences of the European Union, I suppose some of those types of things are inevitable. To the two main points, though, about institutional stability and sustainability, first of all. I like to think at the moment as the European Union as a political construct has considerable stability and indeed a great degree of trust among its citizens to keep on doing the types of things that it's been doing up until now. If you like, it's like a backwards looking stability or sustainability, i.e. there is a kind of consensus of what the European Union does do. What there isn't is any sort of consensus about the types of things that it could potentially additionally do in the future. I.e., my response overall to the critique which is posed by British Brexiteers is, well, the European Union is about to collapse, is, well, probably not, actually. Even if you look at the public support for the European Union, even in countries where the governments have a problem with the European Union, in Poland or in Hungary, for example, is actually there is massive public support for the European Union. The European Union is as popular today in Germany as it's been for any point in the previous 2 decades, i.e. the types of policy fields that the European Union is active in and the European Union as it currently stands are relatively sustainable in that respect. The question is, what does the future hold? And is there a danger that some of those foundations on which the European Union is essentially built could potentially begin to erode? Now, we've got an ideal bad example of that, which is what's happened with regard to the negotiation on the multi-annual financial framework, which was initially an extremely good policy response and potentially fiscal policy response to the challenges which were posed to Europe's economies as a result of the coronavirus. But as simultaneously, actually, the very agreement on the multi-annual financial framework has been derailed due to the problem of the rule of law conditionality, which has been so controversial for both Poland and Hungary. I.e., you have a situation where an institutional issue has got in the way of one of the actually objectively good quality policy responses that the European Union has potentially agreed with regard to the future of the future economies to rebuild after Corona. So how do you manage to combine those two things together? Now, the European Union has essentially can potentially bulldoze through and past that opposition, knowing full well that Poland and Hungary are financially dependent on funds from the European Union, and so therefore in a relatively weak negotiating position. But nevertheless, essentially the net payer countries have not been too willing to manage to push that issue. So how do you relate those two levels, where when you have member states that are kind of challenging a fundamental basis of the European Union, and that has a direct impact on whether you come up with a multi-annual financial framework that is workable or not? Two other examples with regard to, in a very different way, of potentially democratic and institutional concerns are two other issues which touch upon hard policy areas of environmental policy. One has been the vote on the reform of the common agricultural policy about 1 month ago now, an area where the European Union does have clear competence, where you essentially saw a watering down of the commitments to greening agriculture and a political deal that was essentially struck by the S&D, EPP and Renew Europe in the European Parliament to water down the environmental commitments that had been proposed in CAP reform by the European Commission. That led to some howls of discontent from the Greens and even some howls of discontent from the European Commission. That's a very old reasoning and rationale there. You essentially had a question, without going into it in depth, of lobbyist capture of that policy area, where those that lobbied hardest, essentially farming lobbies in Brussels, essentially could manage to make sure that they watered down the commitments to greening the common agricultural policy, which is exactly the issue that I see in the area that I work on most closely other than Brexit, which is a railway policy in the European Union. there's currently ongoing negotiations about a regulation on railway passenger rights. Basically, if you guarantee passenger rights better in railways, that should mean more people would take the train. Railway companies don't want that, managed to essentially lobby much harder than passengers did, and you ended up with a miserable compromise, which is not in the interest of railway passengers, but limits the financial potential damage for railway companies. So even in two areas, the kind of high-level rhetoric for the Green New Deal is not necessarily matched with actually the hard policy in both railway policy and the Common Agricultural Policy, for slightly different reasons potentially of democratic dysfunction, either lobby capture or the challenges and the problems of the rule of law as that applies to the multi-annual financial framework. So ultimately, to conclude there, I think there's some interesting issues that we can potentially debate and unpack further. But ultimately, the European Union, as I see it, will exist, will continue to exist, will remain with some degree of institutional sustainability and stability, but the rhetoric that it sets for itself in terms of environmental sustainability perhaps might not be able to be met in terms of quality, in terms of the everyday policy outcomes. I think that's probably enough from me. I'm happy to develop on any of those points when we get to the round of questions and answers.
Thanks so much, Jon. Really interesting thoughts. And I think it's a nice diversity we have here in terms of speakers. We have both academic perspectives and a practitioner point of view. Now, I want to give the floor to the speakers once again for their comments and response to each other. And I think we can follow the same order. So maybe I can start with Dr. Rosa Fernandez. So Dr. Fernandez, floor is yours if you want to comment and respond to the remarks from other speakers.
Thank you very much. Yeah, very interesting points brought by Jonas and Jon. I would say with regard to Jonas that the one of the main issues that I see is not so much this harder governance per se. I think that there are too many limitations by that attempt to have the soft governance working and this harmonization and trying not to be too intrusive with the member states. One of the things that I see missing is in those possibilities of measures, financial penalizations. That's something that if we are going to be serious about what's going to happen in the future, and since a lot of actors, let's say, seem to only react when they see economic consequences of their actions, I think the economic and financial element of penalization and of governance should be reinforced. It's unfortunately, in my opinion, has been something that, because it's politically controversial, has not been used enough, and perhaps there is much more to do in this case. And with regard to Jon, I think you have rightly caught up with some of these ideas about, and similar to Jonas as well, about where the EU has competencies and where it doesn't have competencies and where it can go in the future. We have still an issue of the democracy and the rule of law. What right now seems to become a problem, and is wanting to link the multi-annual financial framework to the rule of law. Why should that be a problem when adherence to the rule of law was a requirement in the Copenhagen Agreement for all the countries to join in the first place? So what these countries perhaps are indicating is that, oh, they are not interested in following the rule of law, and the rest of Europe should be happy about that. Why should that be the case? again, obviously quite controversial to suggest something more rigid when the current situation with COVID makes things more complicated, but it also may bring opportunities in the sense that all the countries are going to need probably more financial support and more participation and collaboration from the EU institutions to become stronger and to build the right infrastructures, including the transport link and the like. So perhaps can you see some opportunities there? I agree that there is a risk of democracy being eroded in some member states, perhaps in that sense, and yeah, Poland and Hungary are examples of that, but perhaps we can also see more in other countries as well. And well, Brexit, I could talk about Brexit for months since I'm based in the UK. I will refrain myself from that for the moment. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Fernandez. Really interesting points to pick up, and I think we can have more to talk about on these points when we have the Q&A. Now, let's give the floor to Dr. Schönefeld.
Yeah, thanks to follow up on Rosa's intervention and then also Jon's thoughts. Very useful. I thought. I think there's 2 points that are becoming increasingly important, and in my view will probably also get more important as we go along. And the one is, of course, financing and money. We are now in a situation, as I think both Rosa and Jon emphasized, where public actors are spending again and are spending in big ways in order to try and deal with the current crisis and deal with the immediate economic fallout of that. When you look at things like the Green Deal, we've looked some at the renovation wave, for example, and when you look through that, it isn't entirely clear how the necessary financing for the transition that needs to happen will actually come together. They present a range of options and a range of potential financing sources, but when you try and calculate the numbers that are needed and compare those to the numbers that they're providing in terms of what we're going to get, there still appears to be some gaps that will need to get addressed. So in many ways, the question now is, where is that additional money that is being spent right now going to be spent? Are these basically stopgap measures that basically address short-term economic issues, or are there more long-term measures that both address those short-term issues but also provide for a long-term impact in direction of sustainability? So that's one. But in addition to the financing, I still think that we need to get the governance right. We have seen from research at the Institute of Housing and Environment that money is, of course, important. Resources are important. But if you don't have the adequate governance behind those resources, it can be very difficult. So buildings, for example, are notoriously difficult to address. There's lots of talk of increasing the renovation wave, creating lots of jobs and all the rest of it. But let's face it, if you live in a multi-apartment block and somebody comes in there and says, well, we're going to refurbish the entire thing and basically strip down your apartment to the basic structures and then rebuild the entire thing, more or less. And this is often what's necessary to really move forward and achieve those high gains in efficiency. Then you get all sorts of problems, and the problems you get are understandable in many cases. That people are saying, well, look, I work night shifts. If I then have all this construction during the day, how am I going to do that? Some people may have kids, be of old age, and so on and so forth. And when you compound that with, let's say, ownership structures in buildings, that you get buildings that are owned by investment societies that are located elsewhere offshore. So how do you get a hold of them? How do you work with them to move things forward? Then you need to think about governance. Simply throwing money at that probably won't do the deal, and it won't get things done with the speed that we need. So I think that's something also for us, also for people who are UASIS members and who work on those kinds of things. Let's think those things together. And when you think of governance, of course, you then also get into all these other issues that Jon mentioned with regard to democracy, with regard to the legitimacy of the European Union, of the European institutions. I do share your sense, Jon, that I think there is a tremendous amount of stability in the European institutions. I also think that the way that Brexit has played out so far hasn't exactly motivated other countries to take that route. And so I think that for better or for worse creates more stability. It's sort of in a negative way, but it does create stability in the European institutions. But going forward, the challenges will increase, and it's not going to get easier to get the things done that we'll need to get done in the European Union. So this question of how do you deal with areas where member states are really reluctant to integrate will, I think, remain an important question. And I'll stop there and hand over to Jon.
Nothing more for me to say here at this point. Let's go into the Q&A.
Okay. So let's then move on to Q&A. So any questions to our speakers? We're happy to take them and hear from them in response.
Or indeed comments for that matter as well, I'm sure would also be quite possible.
Maybe I can start with a question. I was taking some notes as you were making your contributions. So I had a question about this European Green Deal, and particularly the question was to Dr. Fernandez. And I was wondering, one of the concepts attached to European Green Diplomacy, Green Deal, was green diplomacy. And of course, this remains rather vague at the moment, and there are a lot of unknowns of this. But I just wondered, can this concept of green diplomacy and the ambitions attached to that, can this strengthen the EU's existing diplomatic outreach to the rest of the world, and particularly on climate action and the energy transition? I'm asking this because as a research area, I'm interested in normative power Europe, how EU sort of promotes its own norms, and how can we sort of see if this green diplomacy will strengthen the EU's existing diplomatic outreach on climate action.
Thank you, Varis, for the question. The EU has considered itself for years a leader in anything that has to do with climate change. When there hasn't been a clear leader anywhere else in the world, it's been relatively easy for it to take that position. What we are seeing right now is that with initiatives, for instance, like the energy community, where countries have been trying to adhere to the EU energy regulations, many of them with the hope and with the aim of becoming member states at some point. That has enabled the EU for a relatively long period of time to extend its normative power over countries in their neighboring area. I think things are changing and are more confused right now, particularly with anything that has to do with energy, because the message is quite mixed. The EU still wants to have that role and wants to be the one who provide best practices that other countries can implement. But at the same time, is creating a situation in which, by trying to decrease its energy dependency from third countries and going for renewables and the like, is making uncomfortable some countries that have been their usual suppliers of those fossil fuels. So it's challenging for them, I think, to some extent, to accept some more things that the EU will want for them. I mean, there are mechanisms for cooperations, and there has been dialogue. I think in some sense, in some forums, that dialogue has stopped to some extent. So, for instance, there hasn't been a high-level meeting with the OPEC countries since 2016. That's something that says a bit. And there is also the situation of with COVID, the decrease in the use of fossil fuels. So I think what is happening with the economy is going to be conditioning the development of future diplomacy conversations with certain countries, particularly fossil fuel producers. There is definitely an opportunity at the UN level, I think, for future climate negotiations. The EU has been a clear advocate of the development of the Paris Agreement and implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030. And in that sense, I think it probably will try to go in that direction to exert some more influence in some developing countries in particular. So I think it's possible that the EU is going to be searching for new partners or new countries over which it can extend part of its influence in that sense. And it may be necessary that it moves from the traditional speakers that they have been dealing with in the past. But it's quite muddled at the moment, I think. Not sure if I answer.
No, sure. A really good point to mention, because like I said, I'm always interested in EU diplomacy and how it sort of transform the preferences of others. And in past, not my area of expertise, but in past I saw some examples where the EU had to adapt its discourse and actions in line with the preferences of others rather than the other way around. So it's really interesting to hear. Thank you very much. So in the chat room, I can see that Rachel and Olga have some questions. So can I start with Rachel's questions and comments?
Yeah, thank you very much. And thanks to all three of you for your presentations and comments. It was really interesting. So Rosa mentioned about the role of citizens briefly in her, which is where I first wrote it down. In her presentation, and I wondered if we could maybe get into that kind of a bit more, because as I listened to the other discussions and the talk about the EU at an institutional level being quite firm and stable and on this front, but I'm also kind of thinking about popular discourse at the minute, and that there is a lot of social will behind environmental policies, and people are interested in ways that they weren't maybe so much before, even if that's just through the popularity of David Attenborough and him getting Instagram or whatever. But do you feel like there's kind of two spheres, that there's a disconnect between the EU as an institution doing work for citizens who are abstract kind of ideas, and then work and activism amongst citizens, and I suppose in that kind of, when you're thinking about it, this is why I couldn't type these questions. What do you think the future role of activism is for citizens? What action should we be taking? how can we work together across Europe, I guess, in a community kind of a sense. I know that, like in Jon's Twitter bio, he says he's, you know, a European with a British passport. I'm, you know, an Irish person with a British passport, so it's the same kind of deal. So even though we're leaving Europe, I feel like I feel like the community will still be there. So yeah, what kind of can we do on an individual level? What is the future of activism, and can those kind of spheres, if you think there are two spheres, kind of, you know, join up somewhere, and you know, how can that kind of move forward? So yeah, some random thoughts there, but look forward to hearing anything you have to say on it.
Thanks, Rachel. So, Dr. Fernandez, would you like to respond?
Sure. I think in the past there has been probably a bigger disconnect than the one that we have now. I think particularly since the energy union package, where citizen ownership was put at the forefront, there has been, at least at the high level, an attempt to include citizens and their participation in the approval of new rules. What I saw is that the initial documentation of the European Green Deal presented that citizens' participation in a more diluted way than the EU, that the Energy Union did. And what has happened is that other aspects of the deal, like the climate law and the like, have shown much more progress than the citizens' participation. There is at the moment an initiative to create the Citizens' Assembly, but there has been a consultation process, and at the moment they are still thinking of who's going to be in it, who's going to really participate. So when you are still more than a year later, still wondering who's going to be part of it, it indicates to me that they really do not have much idea of how to include citizens. And I think that is problematic. So in a way, is attempt to do something from the high level that really needs to include the bottom level. And I would be much more positive if I saw directly initiatives coming from the bottom level to be taken by the high level, and communication channels being much more direct. It's not that I think that there is two completely separated spheres, but I think so far, when it comes to citizens' participation in most of the member states, what you have is this consultation process before something is implemented, and that's about it. And then once something is implemented, citizens are not asked again if they are happy with the result of what has been implemented. So this links with what Jonas was mentioning about monitoring. Monitoring needs to take place at the institutional level, but it also needs to take place at the citizens level. And that bit is not happening. The only mechanisms that citizens will have is to vote against those measures in the next election. And it's not always quick enough. And it's not always possible. So there needs to be much more. I think it is possible to narrow the gap, and I think it's possible, and definitely it is necessary to have much more direct participation of citizens, particularly for sustainability. The activism movement, going into the your other question, is really extremely important, is more active than ever, because I mean, you can see this is not just about Greta Thunberg, is the plastic emergency here in the UK has become absolutely crazy, but in other countries there are other aspects where citizens have really raised their voices, and at least the message of the politicians is that they are listening to the citizens. I'm going to be very skeptical here, because between what the politicians say and what they do, there tends to be a wide difference, should we say. So I think there needs to be a higher level of accountability. And there needs to be created a mechanism for that accountability from the citizens to happen, not just each time that you have an election. It has to be much more constant and continuous involvement, because effectively what politicians and governments are deciding about is something that affects each of us in our everyday lives. So it cannot be left to somebody who doesn't know what's happening at the low level, like Jonas as well was mentioning, and things not being taken into consideration. When I see consultation processes, I see academics, I see companies, I see government representatives' participation on it. To see individual citizens participating in those high-level consultation process, and actually anything that the citizen says really being implemented or incorporated in the legislation is still quite rare. And that really needs to change. I think Jon probably will want to say something about it. I can see.
I really agree with the theme that you've stated there, Rosa. But I have to say I'm rather skeptical about whether the EU institutions are politically capable of really doing that. I also say that a bit again with a kind of a party political hat on. Let me give a completely different example. So there's an old colleague of mine here in Berlin who's based in Berlin on an everyday basis. I didn't say that at the beginning. Who's running for the German Green Party's Bundestag election list, and he's a energy policy specialist. He should be exactly the type of person that you would want to have in order to make that connection between energy activists on the ground and elected politics. But the Green Party is very fearful of him because he speaks his mind and he upends some of the traditions within the party. They would sooner have people who are willing to basically toe the party line. And I, in the area I work on in EU policy in the Green Party, have had similar conflicts, right? Because I wanted much more on the railway passenger rights issue that I talked about in my introduction, and had some conflict with a member of the European Parliament for the German Greens who essentially, as I saw it, was basically suffered to a certain extent from lobby capture. Now, there are some cases where the European Union politicians have realized that if they play with that issue of public opinion, it can help them overcome certain vested interests in the Brussels policymaking discussion. So when I'm doing my consultancy rather than doing academic work and dealing with digital communications, we talk a lot about a campaign in fishing policy in Brussels called Hugh's Fish Fight, which was run by the British television chef Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall to basically come up with a green policy on fishing. And he parked a fishing boat outside the European Parliament with the slogan on the side of it. He said, "You can't ignore 670,000 citizens," he said. And every time you signed the petition, the number on the side of this fishing boat went up. Now, to a certain extent, you can ignore 676,000 citizens. And indeed, you can ignore millions and millions of citizens without any difficulty. But the rapporteur in the European Parliament realized that gave her a lever to push for a greener reform of fishing policy against the vested interests of the industries in that sector. Now, if I were in the shoes of Frans Timmermans at the moment, for example, I would be trying to find ways and means of using that direct citizen participation as a way of basically bulldozering my view through against vested interests in the Brussels EU policymaking circles. But I'm pretty skeptical about whether he's actually really doing that to a large extent. But that will be how I would try and do it, essentially to try to see if I can basically latch on to semi-organized civil society as a way and means of trying to push for more radical outcomes in the Green New Deal. But ultimately, my experience in politics, in party politics and observing MEPs very closely is I don't think that very many members of the European Parliament, due to the way that it would be a change of behavior from the way they got selected if they were to then actually do that and govern that way. All right? So that's where I see where the rub is. So I agree with Rosa's point that it would be very desirable, but I'm very skeptical about whether the politicians we have in Brussels just now are actually really capable of making that jumping that gap.
I share your level of skepticism as well. Don't worry.
Jonas, would you like to add anything to this point?
Sure. Yeah. Maybe. I think one of the big questions that we have right now is how much of the things that have emerged during the Corona crisis are actually going to stay for the long term, and what does that mean for sustainability governance? One of the things that, also responding to Rosa's point and to Jon's skepticism, I think what we've observed is almost the exact opposite of what Rosa has been describing, in the sense that we've observed the hour of the executive. Governments have been at the center of dealing with the Corona crisis. It's been very much executive politics. When you look at Germany, for example, we've had a long debate here about, the extent to which the parliament should be involved in making decisions regarding the Corona crisis. So I think that is an important thing. So how much of that will the strength of the executive continue beyond the Corona crisis? What does that mean for governing sustainability? My feeling is that sustainability politics has usually been portrayed as a very much a bottom-up type of politics. I think people who've advocated things here have often said it's very important to include citizens in the way that Rosa described. On the other hand, we also know that doing consultation procedures, doing all of these things, of course, also takes time. So democracy takes time. And so the question is, how do we then square the need of making very rapid progress? The Green Deal's targets will come around very soon. 10 years is not a long time, and the targets are steep, and they will get steeper as we go on. How do we square the need to involve citizens with the need for very speedy progress? And I'm afraid I don't have any answers on that. But I think in part, what's happening with the COVID crisis now, how much of that sticks, will probably make some difference. So let's see how that plays out.
Yeah, thanks to all our three speakers for picking up on those points, and thanks also, Rachel, for the question. Now let's hear from Olga about her questions and comments.
Hi, thank you very much for very interesting inputs. And I think my question actually comes at the very right time in the discussion, because I wanted to touch more about the political parties and the powers involved in the countries themselves. Because just to throw in my personal opinion as well about the sustainability questions in general, because I come from Russia and I kind of see how it works in the other countries, and been living in Europe for a long time, in Germany, in Switzerland, so I have an experience of this. And I can say that all the questions about sustainability among citizens, they also arise at some level of economic development. So you don't have, when you travel to India, for example, you see these polluted areas, you don't see people thinking about plastics. Although they know it's polluting everything around, they still don't do anything about it because they have other problems to worry about. And especially now with COVID crisis, the priorities also of citizens and their everyday needs changed a lot, with economic problems and everything. So I would like to hear your opinion about actually the possibility to comply to the goals and to fulfill the goals on time from different countries, because of course the European Union, we talk about, it's kind of an institution, but we have political situation in different countries where we have different powers. Like now, I've been living in Austria for the last year, and we have Green Party who came to power, and you can see the changes. Or even in the city of Vienna, where the Greens were governing before with Social Democrats, you can see everyday changes, and you can actually see how citizens' initiatives before their local elections, the city elections, worked. But it's of course not the situation, I would think, in Poland, in Hungary, where the political discourse is very different. And despite agreeing to everything on the European level, with other priorities in hand, also some political issues and problems that parties face, how can you assess maybe the situation? Also talking from Jon's side about the green parties in power in different countries, because of course they can push their agenda in government, but when they are not in the government, on their from what I know from Hungary, for example, they don't have even strong green parties, or in some other countries, then you just don't have a voice even on political level, not talking about the citizens.
Thanks, Olga. Really good question. Can we start with Jon this time?
It's a really hard question to answer this, although at least I think there's an interesting issue in Poland, which has been how to look at the coal burning issue, not as an issue of environmental sustainability, but an issue of air quality, actually, due to the direct pollution which has been caused as a result of it. And if you want to deal with the pollution, it can often be easier to actually essentially get rid of the coal-fired plant or the coal-fired housing heating than actually trying to clean up the burning of coal, i.e. you've had a sort of change of the mentality which has driven environmental protection as a result of economic concern rather than as a result of direct political pressure. So potentially there's something interesting there. There's also the issue that there's been for the development of green parties in the Baltic states, in Latvia, for example. So they're members of the Green ZFA group, although they're not members of the European Greens as a political party, which have been kind of more agrarian Greens, i.e. kind of protection of rural way of life. So there's potentially something to build on there. The difficulty is, and that's, I fear also for many of those organizations, having also had some conversations with Hungarian Greens and actually done some communications training with some of the two parties that became essentially a basic split in the Hungarian Greens. You need administrative strength in order to manage to fight in a really hard political environment. And whatever we might think of their political goals, Fidesz is a fearsome opponent in Hungarian politics. And there is still incredible administrative weakness in Green parties. After having spent very many years in the Labour Party in the UK and then joining the Greens when I moved to Germany, the German Greens are the most administratively strong Green Party there is in Europe, but still have only something pushing 90,000 members even now, and feeling like a very, very small party to me in comparison to the British Labour Party, which itself has had its fair share of administrative dysfunction. And so the efforts that were done in the 1990s to strengthen party development across the political spectrum seem, at least in Green Party movements, to a certain extent to have stalled. So it's completely the right question to ask, but I don't have simple and straightforward answers to those points, unfortunately. There's also the considerable weakness even in the other mainstream parties. If you look at the kind of turnover of political parties, how they form and split in Slovenia, for example, which has ultimately been the economically strongest of the 12 countries that joined the European Union in 2004 and 2007, even they have not managed to get to a stage where you can have a kind of a stable party system. But is that an issue of the transition to democracy, or is that other issues of kind of weakening of party political structures in general, and those things are happening in parallel? So I have no simple answers to that, but at least the Polish example, I'll dig out some things I've read about that. The Polish example of air pollution driving energy change is at least an interesting one, which gives me a bit of a hope of a different way of looking at the problem. I'll dig it out and I'll put it in the chat.
Thanks so much. And there was an interesting point that Rachel raised. She was given an example of the Green Party resignations in Green Party in Ireland recently. I think it raises important questions about party coherence, which was actually one of the seminar topics that I was for the module that I was teaching last week. Would any other speakers would like to pick up on these points?
I was just going to make a quick comment because Olga asked about different countries, and it's true that not all the member states have a strong Green parties. Spain is one of those countries where there is no Green Party at the national level of politics. You can have some representations of some parties with links to green ideas more at the regional level, perhaps, but not so much at the national level, which, if I can use the expression, I think right now is completely dysfunctional. It's not the only country where that has happened, and the problem I see is that some of the perhaps traditional parties, the division between conservative and Labour, or socialist and popular, or whatever you want to call them, some of them where there is no a strong Green Party, they have tried to get advantage of that and include some green messages in their own manifestos. And we see differences in each country. So in Spain, it has been to some extent the Socialist Party. In Portugal, there hasn't been anything really, nor in Italy that I can recall at the moment. But for instance, in the UK, having a Green Party, you can see a shift in the message of the Conservative Party now, with the green plans, green infrastructures, green everything, and the Liberal Democrats also picking up on that message as well. So the messages and the policies and the advocacy of green parties is something that is attractive for everybody else, because it attracts voters. So some other parties may be picking up on it, and in the end diluting the real actions. So I'm not really that positive in the future of what can be achieved in that sense. Thank you.
If I may add as well on this issue, that's exactly why I asked, because I did my own research in my dissertation about framing. And one of the cases was environmental, like ecological framing, which is now picked up by mainstream parties. And we see it a lot in many cases, but the thing is, just by framing something as green doesn't really mean that they comply to the real meaning behind it. And then, of course, the issue that you mentioned with the fight between the green parties, the same situation is in Switzerland. They had a split. They have two green parties. And of course, they fight for the same electorate. And we shouldn't forget that it's also the leftist party. So their agenda also crisscrosses with the social democrats in many countries. So it's not really easy to push this to agenda. And I think the biggest kind of mainstream parties pretending to be green is whether they are stealing also some part of electorate from the true green party, so to say, but not committing, like talking about the issues, but of course they're not central for their agenda, and they're not committing to do something in the long run. And of course, you say like 10 years is not much, but in 10 years, these politicians might not be aware and not be held accountable to what they're doing now. So it's always possible to postpone, especially now with COVID, I think. But it's very interesting that like you see some other issues also driving the changes, and it's good to know. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. There is also a lively discussion that was going on, some interesting links that were being shared. So Nikolai Kristen Surabara, he shared a link to a researcher who produced some research on green parties in Europe. And then Jon was sharing the link for the Poland smog issue. And for those who would like to check out, they're in the chat box. So looking at the chat box, I also remember seeing Carlos has a question as well.
Yes, thank you very much, Baris, and good evening to everyone. I apologize in advance for my very slow connection, so please let me know if you cannot hear me very well. I have a question for Dr. Jonas Schönefeld. I was actually initially hesitant as to whether I should ask it because I didn't want to take the focus of the panel away from sustainability as such. But since we're already towards the end of the panel, I mean, here it goes. I found this idea of harder soft governance really, really interesting. And therefore, I was wondering to what extent this increased control over policy monitoring is exclusive to climate policy, or whether we're seeing these practices in other policy sectors as well. Could we actually say that climate policy is a pioneering sector, so to say, in this sense, and other policy sectors are following its lead? Or could you elaborate a bit on this? Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for the question. So what we did in the special issue that I talked about, we actually took the energy union as one place where harder soft governance now appears to be emerging, and then looked at other areas where that has already been implemented, or where there are developments in that direction. And you're absolutely right that there are other areas where this sort of governing has emerged. And I think one of the biggest examples of it is the European semester, which is economic governance, which came about after the last financial crisis. So late 2000s, 2010, 11, and so on, when the European Union or the European institutions understood that they needed some level of budgetary and fiscal coordination, but struggled to implement that through the regular community method because of lack of competences once again. And so they managed to implement that regular review process, semesters every 6 months, so to see how the member states are doing economically and so on. And when you look at the European semester, they've managed to introduce a number of ways in which, for example, the recommendations of the European Commission then have to be taken into account, and there's sort of consequences if you don't. And so yeah, so you can definitely see that in that policy area, and I think also being implemented with some success. The question is, what will happen in the context of sustainability policy? Will that generate strong effects? Will that really nudge things in the direction that the European institutions want or don't? I had one more point actually about an earlier question that I just wanted to bring up, because I think it is a recent development. I don't know whether you followed the new U.S. government coming together and the government of Joe Biden. I think one thing to watch. Somebody asked about, I think Bears asked about the EU's international diplomacy. Interestingly enough, it seems like Biden is going to appoint John Kerry as his main advisor for climate change, and I think that is a very strong signal to the international community in terms of saying that that the U.S. will engage again. I expect that the Biden administration will very quickly rejoin the Paris Agreement once it will assume power in January, and then I think by putting John Kerry there, who negotiated, the Paris Agreement with others who had a very central role in this process, I think that sends a very strong role. Something to watch, I think, is what is going to happen to the Sino-American deal, because one of the reasons why I think EU leadership on climate change has also gone down is that the emissions have gone down in the European Union, and that the chunk that the European Union has of the pie has just become smaller, which is a good thing. But geopolitically, it of course then shifts the attention over to others, most notably China, the US, as countries that are very, very important.
Okay, thanks very much, Jonas, and thanks also, Carlos, for the question. I think we are quite good in time management today, so we have only 4 minutes to finish the roundtable. So let me first thank you to our 3 speakers for being available to join us today. It was my pleasure to host them, and also I would also like to thank on behalf of the UASIS Graduate Forum Committee. Also, a short announcement. So after today, after this session, we're gonna have a social hour with as UASIS Graduate Forum Committee, and we're inviting for those who would like to spend some time with us as well. So I'm gonna be sharing the link on the chat room for those who would like to attend. And also a second announcement: there are still openings at the committee positions. So if you'd like to hear more about these and you'd like to hear more about UASIS Graduate Forum Committee, you're more than welcome to join us in the social hour, where I hope that we'll be able to talk about these points. Okay, so thanks again for everyone for being available today, and I hope you have a good weekend in advance, and I hope to see you again in another event. Thanks very much.